Thank you very much for joining me. Well, I think it's about time we took a look at Afghanistan, that hotbed of military conflict. Now, Sherlock Holmes, on first meeting Dr. Watson, who was later to be his great friend and companion, remarks, quote, "You have been in Afghanistan, I perceive," unquote, and then proceeds in his usual masterly fashion to describe precisely how he reaches that conclusion. But already in the first words of the very first Sherlock Holmes novel, A Study in Scarlet, Watson has provided an account of his unhappy experiences in the Second Anglo-Afghan War. Because of its position plumb in the middle of Central Asia, Afghanistan is a prize that's been fought over and won by foreign occupiers many times in its long history. Its domestic story is equally turbulent, with warring tribes battling it out over the centuries for power and control. In 2018, the basic pattern persists. Now, it was in the first part of the 19th century, at the apogee of the imperial history of Great Britain, that the country perceived Afghanistan to be a major strategic objective. The Russian Empire was expanding rapidly to the south, and Afghanistan, which lay adjacent to Britain's Indian Raj, could not be allowed to fall within the Russian sphere of influence and thus threaten India. Britain first invaded the country in 1838, at the start of what came to be known as the Great Game, a struggle for power and influence in Central Asia between the British and the Russian empires. That first invasion was a disaster, but nothing deterred. Britain invaded a second time in 1878 and was more successful. It gained control over Afghanistan's external affairs and established the country as a permanent buffer between its Indian Empire and Russia. But of course, the dynamics of the situation changed dramatically following Britain's withdrawal from India in 1947. And from the early 50s, pro-communist, indeed pro-Soviet rulers prevailed in Afghanistan. And 20 years later, General Mohammed Daoud Khan overthrew the monarchy and established a republic closely aligned to the Soviet Union, with himself as president. When he was killed in a coup 5 years later, a battle for power ensued. But by then, a new element had entered the situation: the rise of conservative Islamic and ethnic religious leaders. Swiftly gaining clout, they established a guerrilla movement called the Mujahideen and engineered an armed revolt against the pro-Soviet leadership. Now, when President Noor Mohammad Taraki was assassinated, alarm bells were set ringing in the Kremlin, and in 1979, the USSR invaded. The Mujahideen rebels united against the Soviet invaders, as well as the USSR-backed Afghan army, and the fighting dragged on year after year. By 1989, the USSR had admitted defeat and withdrew its troops. But the turbulence had left its legacy. The establishment by Osama bin Laden of the jihadist group Al-Qaeda, later the rise of the Islamist organization calling itself the Taliban, and finally the incursion into Afghanistan of Islamic State. A series of terrorist attacks by Al-Qaeda against American embassies in Africa led to demands for bin Laden to be handed over, demands ignored by the Taliban. The final straw came with the destruction of the Twin Towers in New York on September the 11th, 2001. Within a month, the United States and British forces began airstrikes against Taliban targets in Afghanistan prior to an invasion by ground troops, and the Taliban were chased from their strongholds. But 17 years later, despite enormous efforts by the US and Britain to stabilize the country, train the military, and establish a democratic form of government, the Taliban are still fighting against government forces around Kabul and engaged in a three-way battle against Islamic State in the north. The West, however, has taken a hard line against the Taliban's latest campaigns. On August the 13th, 2018, the UK Prime Minister Theresa May announced that 440 more British military personnel would join the NATO mission in Afghanistan, whose task is to train, advise, and assist the Afghan security forces. As for the Americans, they returned 2 years ago in smaller numbers than previously, but if they had not returned, says their commander, Brigadier General Ben Watson, quote, I would imagine that Helmand would be pretty solidly under the Taliban right now, unquote. History shows that Afghanistan is both a military quagmire and a political and diplomatic minefield. The current fighting seems to have narrowed down to a battle for Western values against the Islamist aspirations of both the Taliban and Islamic State. It does not seem to be a battle with a foreseeable outcome. Well, thank you very much for listening, and do please join me again next time. Goodbye.